It says I'm sharing. All right. Are you all able to see my slide deck now?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So yeah, as Dave mentioned, my background is I'll go through my background here in a little bit, but I work, if you think of the technology stack, what I'm assuming is probably on the other end from many of you. So I'm at the human end of it, and lead a research team at a company called Blink UX, which I'll explain a little bit about what we do. And I lead our team, and our team conducts user research, and we partner with design teams and technology teams to help understand the people that are using the technology, what struggles they're having, and ultimately how to make it a better experience for them, and hopefully in some cases lead to better technology adoption as well. So what we'll talk about today, I'll have a little bit of introduction, one slide on myself, say a little bit about my background, how I went and got a PhD in video games. And then I'll have a little overview of what is UX research or user experience research and why we do it. And then go through a couple of different approaches to it. And that we have sort of three big buckets that we tend to think about, and then have some question and answer time. Of course, I have a question and answer at the end. I'm totally open to people jumping in and interrupting me and asking clarifying questions, or when it comes to talking to a new group, you're never 100% certain of what everyone knows about user research and so forth. And so if there are things that you want more depth on or less depth, let me know, and I can pivot as we go along. I'm used to doing that. Does that sound all right? All right. Without that, I will go in. So a little bit about my career here. So I started, I was thinking back about this the other night, and started really researching technology and human interaction in about the year 2000. That's when I started grad school, as my dad said. And really what led me to that was I was a classroom teacher before that. And so I taught elementary school kids. That's sort of what my education background is in. And one of the things I found is that there's a lot written, now there is, and in the late 90s there certainly was, about the promise of technology in education. And I started out as a teacher and very eager to make a difference in kids' lives. And one of the things I noticed was that the technology, the computers, really kind of sat in the back of the classroom and didn't get used. And this was taking place, a little bit of context, I live in Seattle, Washington now. At the time I was teaching in Bellevue, Washington, which is sort of the right in a really highly technical area of not just our country, but the world in general. And so, this was sort of well-funded technology, and in a place where kids had access to a lot of computers and so forth. And primarily it wasn't really getting used. And so that led me to start asking questions about, well, why is that? And maybe what can we do about it? And led me to graduate school in educational technology. And eventually I ended up not able to leave graduate school, and they wouldn't let me go. And so 6 years later, I ended up with a PhD in learning sciences. And as part of that, I studied how kids learn to play video games. And so I did an ethnographic study, which meant that I went and watched kids play video games and really tried to understand how they learn to play them. And as a way to understand learning and how it happens in the real world to help inform education. And I did that for several years, about 10 years. And then I was on the faculty at the University of Georgia for 3 years, and eventually decided to leave academia and specialize in UX research. And that's when I joined the company I'm with now, Blink, and really started taking those skills and applying it specifically to things like usability testing, or what we call foundational research or evaluative research. And I've been doing that for the last 10 years now. And I have here 2020 survived the COVID pandemic like everyone else here. But in reflecting on it, it really has forced us to rethink some of our assumptions about how we go about conducting this kind of research. And that's because a lot of it we have done typically in person. And that means interviewing people in their work settings, or having them come into we have a lab facility, and come in there and talk with them there. Oftentimes that's necessary because we have hardware we're testing. And we've had to really think about how now to either take that remote and use software like Zoom or 8x8 to conduct these sessions, or to create a safe environment for people to come in and for us to do research in that capacity. So as I'll talk a little bit today about how we've changed those kinds of things. So real quick, my marketing people, my company wouldn't let me get away with this without saying something about Blink. So we're a product innovation firm. We were founded in Seattle, Washington in 2000. And the key part of this really is that we use what we call evidence-driven design. And what that means is that we conduct a lot of research to base the interface designs that we have and the technologies in what users say they need and want, and really observing their behaviors. And so ultimately, we think that leads to creating things that people will use, love, and remember, and ultimately get a lot out of. So a quick overview of UX research here, and what is it? So it's really a systematic inquiry that's focused on the people that we're designing for, building technologies for, and the context in which they're using those. So either their homes, workplaces, or increasingly now, all about in the world when you start talking about things like wearable devices and various other kinds of connected devices. And so we do that to really inform about who we're serving, what problems they have, and really creating solutions for them that are going to ultimately, hopefully, do great things for them. So why do we do this? Well, one, we really need to understand those people that we're building for, and we find it's one of the parts of the job that I like best, that I don't typically now get as many opportunities to do, but is to interview people and talk with them about how they're using technology and what they're using it for. And what that leads to is for us to really, the solutions we come up with are then really grounded in the real world, and not assumptions about what we think they may want, but based on our observations of where we see they're struggling and what they need, then we're actually solving real problems. In terms of developing products or technologies, it ultimately, we find it ends up saving time, money, effort, and that you don't build the wrong thing, and you sort of get it right the first time. It also ends up raising the level of confidence in what we do, so that we're not we're reducing risk, and we're more confident in what we're producing. And we also do this because we find there's always more to learn. We live in an evolving world, and things are constantly changing. Obviously, the last year we found that there's a ton out there that has shifted and changed for people. And so having the ability to really talk with people and engage with them in a deep way, as well as sort of in a more scaled way across many people, helps us really understand how things have shifted and changed. Couple, here we go. There's all these kinds of quotes. I threw a couple of these in here about why to do research. So 50% of development time is spent doing avoidable work. This one, $1 to fix problems early on can be $100 to fix it after the release. And there's the industry is sort of awash with these kind of examples of doing research early on allows you to save a lot of money in training expenses and other kinds of development things. I'm going to share an example later on of some passwordless authentication systems. And one of the things in doing that project that, and I'm going to get the number wrong, the astounding amount of money that that banks, for example, spend on IT support or customer support and just password resets is unbelievable, into the millions and millions of dollars per month often. And so developing new authentication systems that sort of are easier to use and more friendly can end up having some real impact. So what are some of the approaches that we have to using research to doing user research? We tend to think about these in sort of three buckets, and you can almost sort of position these on a timeline. And many of these, I'm sure you're familiar with. Usability testing is very common. Obviously, there are surveys and so forth. But at one end, we have what we call foundational research. And really, this is about exploring and trying to understand sort of what the problems are that people are having, even apart from maybe the specific technology that you're looking at, but related to it. What does the overall context look like that they're working in, or their home life and so forth? So we have a variety of different strategies we use for this, and it's primarily qualitative work at that point. And so we tend to have very low sample sizes that allow us to really identify issues and understand their causal nature of them, and understand a lot of the why behind them. And we do this it, because it takes a lot of effort to do that. And we find that you begin to see patterns very quickly, often when you use a low sample size, and that you can then very quickly get into sort of another phase of doing concepting and evaluating solutions. So some of the exploratory work can be things like observational studies, where we might go watch people work in their environment. We'll do longitudinal studies, or what we call diary studies, where we'll ask people to engage in a set, report back to us on a regular basis over the course of a few weeks, and ask them a set of questions about particular aspects of their life. So, one example we had was having parents and kids report to us about their technology use over the course of a couple of weeks, and using that really to sort of understand, when are they adopting certain technologies, and what kind of problems are they trying to solve with them, and how are they using them throughout the course of their lives. Our teams then often begin to create concepts, and these are very low fidelity at a certain point, in the sense that, they're really just what we call clickable prototypes often. So think of an image of a fake UI that you can use to sort of begin to walk people through of what an experience might look like. There is no back end to it. It doesn't capture any data or do anything technical, but it does allow people to begin to imagine what it looks like. There's quite a lot of software out there that does that now. Figma is one you may have heard of, or Envision are very common prototyping software that allow you to do that. And we'll use that to begin doing usability testing, concept evaluation, before we begin building the actual technology, so we can really sort of work out some of the finer points of the user interface at that point. And then finally, after it's released, or at various points, we will begin to measure how things are looking. So that involves using various kinds of data analytics to look at usage patterns in the background. We'll use surveys to do a broad survey of people's needs and what they find valuable, or what they find is working well for them in certain cases as well. So I dive a little deeper into the explore, the kinds of questions we look here. Really, the idea here is to deepen our understanding about the people, understand their needs, mindsets, and really develop a knowledge of the context of use. and use this as a way to allow various people to explore what might be possible to help solve those problems and begin to create solutions for them. So some of the kinds of questions, we might want to understand things about, who else is maybe influencing them as they're using the technology. What sort of, if we're looking at complex workflows, are there other collaborators that we need to understand and what their needs are? What are some of the big problems they're trying to solve? What behaviors, attitudes, mental models, different types of users might be out there that we need to account for? What are some of the pain points and challenges there and opportunities for us to change something for them? And then a lot into the how. So how are they sort of currently solving maybe some of these problems? We can really gain inspiration from that. What are the different sort of what we would call a journey, different ways that they might go about doing something, differ by different types of users, or by the user type? And how do people, think and organize and so forth, can really help us understand how we might, for instance, create the navigation on a site in order to make it make sense for those people. Some of the methods, we have a lot of in-depth interviewing with people, and this is something that has adapted well to our COVID times, in that we're able to connect with people via Zoom and engage with them over an hour or a 90-minute session, and go through a set of activities with them, and really understand them deeply. I mentioned diary studies previously, where we'll have people check in over time with us and provide data that way back to us. In the real times, we would do things like shop-alongs with people. Some of that is starting to happen again as the world begins to open up, but often visiting people in their offices and workplaces, and so forth. Anyway, an example of sort of how we've done a little bit of this work. So a couple years ago, engaged with NASA. Now, one of the things that NASA is known sort of really well for is obviously their space exploration outside of space. One of the things that they also do quite a lot of is they have 12 or so different satellites that are pointed back down at Earth and gather data on the Earth. And this can be anything from the level of sea ice, ocean temperatures, to lightning strikes, various kinds of land formations, and so forth. There is massive quantities of data that NASA collects. And then ultimately what they want to do is provide this out to scientists to use. And the data comes out in a variety of different formats. So it can be very raw, sort of almost no processing done to it, where it's almost you have to be quite specialized to understand what to do with it. Ultimately down to different levels where it might just be images and so forth that somebody can use. NASA distributes this data across a variety of different centers. I think there's 12 different centers of what they call DACs. It's a distributed active archive center. And those DACs are then responsible for providing that data back out to scientists. And one of the things that they consistently sort of find, or that they were hearing, is that it's often difficult to get the data and to process it and get to the point where you're actually doing science with it. So there's a lot of work in just finding the right data set, finding out how to download it, how to get it into your systems, and then how to segment it and work with it in order to do science. And we sort of think there's a gap there, that if we can reduce that time, that we can then increase the volume of science that is being done, and really end up increasing the amount, the quality, and the number of insights that scientists are developing about our Earth and how it's changing. And so what we did is we embarked on a study to really identify the needs of earth scientists, the people who are using this data, by interviewing them and observing them work. um, and then also, we do that by sort of assessing common interaction patterns. So how do they go about finding the data, downloading it, and using the data? We ended up conducting interviews with, in this case, it was about 90 different scientists that we interviewed. We had a team of people doing this. And we structured these interviews in sort of three components here. So the first thing we do when we engage with people is we begin a background interview where we talk with them about sort of, who are you? Like, tell me about your job and what you do. What are you trying to accomplish here? What is your experience? We have a range of people from graduate or postdoc students all the way through to fully tenured faculty members or research scientists in institutes that are using this data. We then engage in what we call co-creation activity. And so in that sense, what we're trying to do is work with the participant to map out their workflow and really identify some of the different pain points that they may be having, and sort of what the understand what's working well for them, and where they view problems. And then we go through, and in this case, we just asked them to go find some data, and we watched what they did, and we assessed in a very kind of evaluative way, how successful were they? Were they actually able to find the data and download the data? So a little bit about the co-creation activities here. In this sense, you can see in the top right here, we sort of put in front of people a grid, and we just ask them, okay, so imagine you had a new research question. Walk me through, what are the different steps you have here? What are the different tools you use? And tell me about this process. And we ask very open-ended questions. And then ultimately have them sort of mark on it in a certain way. In this case, we did these remotely. These scientists were all over the country, and so we were able to do that. But we'll often also, when we have the opportunity with people, just get out paper and pencil or various kinds of cutouts and so forth for them, for people to do those kinds of things. And what we found out of this is that there's really, whereas NASA was really thinking about the people who access this, oftentimes based on their scientific discipline, which is a good way to think about it. We found that there were different ways that they were interacting with the data. So we had what we would call the code connoisseurs, and these are people who were accessing the back ends of the system, using APIs and so forth to download the data directly to any hardware they had or any machines they had. And they have particular needs in wanting to understand when the data is updated, and how to access it, and APIs can change and so forth, and needing that kind of information delivered to them in particular ways. We also had what we would call the GUI gurus. And so these are people who are primarily browsing the web or web interfaces to find the data. And look at it. And interestingly enough, one of the things about the GUI gurus we found is that they often sort of wanted to learn how to end up becoming code connoisseurs at some point. They wanted to sort of up their game. We also had people who, we call data dabblers. So these are people who were maybe not actively, regularly going to find the data, but would have a question at some point and want to sort of every 9 months sort of go in and get data. They aren't doing it on a weekly basis, and so they have particular challenges because they don't have a muscle memory for where to find things on the website, and how to do it. And then we have what we would call the first time finders, and so these are oftentimes students who are people who are very new to the field and really just trying to understand it. And so you have a wide range of people that you end up needing to create solutions for. What we end up doing is mapping this out over, of course, all of those different stages for each of them, and really using that as a way to pinpoint where in this overall journey are there issues that we can maybe address through design. So for example, you'll see here the finding the right data set. There's quite a lot of red. Red would indicate that it's a sort of a painful, a lot of effort and maybe some strong emotions there. And a lot of red and orange. And so, from our standpoint, we end up then working with um, some of these DACs to redesign the interface, the website, to help make it easier for people to find the right data set using a strong visual hierarchy and navigation that sort of maps the way that they think about the data set and so forth. Okay, if I sort of pivot on and move forward here a little bit into the evaluative research that we do. So really here, this is about after we either have something built and we want to understand the usability of it, all the way to maybe we have some concepts that we're thinking about, a couple of different directions with the interface that we might want to take. And this is really where we begin to think about how easy is this to learn? Is this satisfying and enjoyable to use? What sorts of obstacles, points of confusion are people having? And importantly, what is the severity of that? And by that, we mean, is somebody, when they run into an issue with it, likely to end up not being able to get done what they want to do? That would be pretty severe, maybe cause, delete data or something along those lines. We don't worry so much about deleting data these days, as there's a lot of cloud software out there, but it happens, and we want to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen. To also sort of understanding the frequency of those problems. And here again, we're often using very small sample sizes, oftentimes 8 to 10 people, because once we really identify that an issue is present and we see it, just a handful of times, we can really understand that severity and what's causing it, and then end up generating solutions and go into another round of testing if we feel like we need to do it at that specific point. So these are often moderated studies that we're doing. We'll have a researcher engage with a participant in a one-on-one session. We do a lot of these now remotely, where using prototyping software that I mentioned before, Figma, Envision, we can put stuff in front of people and have them share our screen and go through an experience and really understand what's happening there. We'll often also do unmoderated testing, which is, there's a few different solutions out there. One is called usertesting.com. There's also UserZoom and a few others. And what these allow you to do is send something to somebody in almost kind of a survey format, and they go through the experience on their own. And then ultimately, in the end, you're able to watch their flow, and you can do it with a few hundred people and test the success rate on it at that point, and really sort of understand what's happening there. We'll also do with physical hardware, out-of-box experience testing. So you can imagine a new device, say a VR headset, or a new phone, or a game system, or something along those lines. And we have people go through the experience of getting it set up and sort of unboxing that, and really using all of the components that are going to come with it, and begin evaluating and making sure that they're able to get through it successfully, and ultimately, hopefully, reduce various pain points that people may have in doing that. So one quick example here of some evaluative testing that we did. We were partnering with Mozilla, and they were building a web browser for virtual reality. And this is something that they hadn't really done at any point, and wanted to understand, how well that experience worked for people, and what they might do to make it a better overall web browser. So, this was really done with the goal of assessing the ease of use, identifying those opportunities, and thinking about what the next version and beyond might look like. So, this is sort of a picture here of the lab setup that we have, and this is obviously something that you have to be in person to do when you're talking about a VR headset, with potentially some prototype hardware. Whereas many people may not have VR headsets at this point, or have the right software on them to use it. So it introduces quite a few challenges here. The researcher can't easily see, unless you're using special software, what the participant is seeing. So we use there's some tools that we're able to use to sort of mirror that screen and then live stream that out to our clients and so forth. And then obviously here now we have a researcher, is the young woman there sitting next to the participant. And we can't really do that anymore these days. So we've completely changed the arrangement here to where we now have the researcher in another room, and we're able to have, essentially a Zoom meeting connection between the two rooms, and have thought quite a lot about how to make the room sanitary for the participant, and how to clean the headsets, either quarantining them for several days or using UV light. Now we're beginning to use UV light on some components of it to clean it so that it's clean for participants as they come in. And of course, we do all kinds of health screenings and so forth for people coming in. But ultimately, the approach we took with this, so again, another small number of sessions. They're pretty long, so people come in for 90 minutes, and we do sort of what we would call a standard task-based procedure, and we have people think aloud while they're using that to really capture their reactions and struggles. We asked them some questions afterwards. We were worried a little bit about motion sickness in VR, so we asked some wellness questionnaire, some wellness questions there, and asked them to explore the VR environment, do typical web browsing activities. So, get on there and read an article in the browser's focus mode, have them explore some immersive 3D content that's available online, have them do other kinds of activities that people do online, shopping for backpacks, things like that, sharing their reactions, challenges, and ideas. And really, ultimately the outcomes out of this, we think about sort of UI improvements that can have in there. So there's some issues with maybe the discovery of the focus mode, people struggling to open up a private browser, where we can have some impact on this. Thinking about that VR keyboard that, if anyone's ever used a soft keyboard, those things can be really painful. So those kinds of things, but also get some information back from people on what are the sorts of use cases. So here we have, the people really wanted more immersive content. They couldn't see why, why would I just come on here to read an article when I can do that on my phone or my laptop? What Firefox really needed to think about was, how do you help people create immersive content that other people are going to want to go out there and use as a really kind of compelling reason to use their browser in VR. So if we pivot to that third method that I talked about, measuring, in this case, we're really trying to understand or visualize different patterns through analytics. We're often also sort of setting and comparing benchmarks. So we may have, we want to make sure that, all of our users are able to get signed up within 5 minutes, for example, and make sure that we're sort of achieving those specific goals, and tracking them over time, to as we improve the interface, that we're really actually making it better in different ways for people, and often doing it with a larger sample size, looking for statistical relevance at this point. One of the other things we'll often do as well here is compare two different things. So we have here on A/B testing. So really trying to understand sort of what is something that which of these two may be the most efficient or best for people, or that most people tend to get through in the least amount of time, or what have you, or maybe are more likely to return with, and so forth. So one example here, we worked with a company called Trusona to really understand people's login preferences. And in this case, Trusona creates a passwordless multi-factor authentication that a company might use to allow people to log in with biometrics using their app. And we would then compare this to what we think of as a traditional or a classic login. And in that case, that is, what we're all often familiar with, where you type in a username or an email and then a password. Of course, this has, there's many pain points, I'm sure, you've experienced with either forgetting a password, or making sure your password is secure, or using, in the sense of having enough randomization in it, and so forth, or trying to use a password software. There's a lot of different options out there for people. There's a movement to really sort of move towards authentication without password, focusing on biometrics. So that would be fingerprints or a Face ID, are sort of the two primary ones that we have. So what we did was we set up a little bit of an experiment where we asked people to register for a new site. And in this case, it was a fake site around, I think, gift giving or something along those lines. And we asked them to visit this site for multiple times over a 20-day period. And people were given both login options throughout the study. They could either use the easier login that was sort of fast and secure, or the classic login. And we then measured which options they chose and surveyed their preferences. Ultimately, we had almost 150 people complete the study. So we had a rather large number of people in the study. And we found that, people really sort of gravitated to this easier option. And ultimately, even at the outset of it, over half the people only ever use that easy option. We had a smaller sample that tried both of it. And then in the end, we had, a pretty sizable number, but very few who really stuck with that kind of that classic method, the only classic method. And we sort of looked at this also at their final login behaviors. So a lot of numbers here, but really we thought, okay, well, let's look at the last one, and that'll give us the last time they logged in at the end of the study, and that gives us a sense of sort of maybe where they landed at. And in this case, we had up to 14% of the people who had started out with classic and changed to this easy password, and ultimately sort of stayed there at that point. So really quite successful in a way to think about how to help people, or help us understand that this is something that people want to be able to use, and that there's quite a bit of desire from a user standpoint to ease up on some of this password business, so to speak. Anyway, that is what I had prepared for today. I'm open to answering questions if people are up for it at this point.
So I've got a question on your last slide there.
Yeah.
Is there any influence to the use or the preference for the easy login because you labeled it easy login?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was something we went back and forth with on the design. And I would say there probably is. The reason we did that design is because that's the way we would recommend it being implemented in the real world, is by conveying that it is meant to be, it's meant to be more secure and an easier way to do it. And so I would certainly agree with you that there's some amount of bias with that. I think what we would also look at, certainly on that initial one, what we would think about then is, do people end up actually experiencing that way? And so over the course of a long time period, if it wasn't actually easier, then we would see a lot of people switching back and abandoning that specific login method.
Any other questions?
So when you talked about sort of mocking up an interface before you had the back end built.
Yep.
I'm not a front end developer, so I'm not familiar with these tools. Do those tools allow users to actually interact with it, or is it just
Yeah.
screenshots?
Yeah. Well, it depends on which tool you're using. And sort of how much effort you put into it. But ultimately, yes, you can. It's interesting. You can do things like, enter in, say, an email address and click enter. And it'll act like it is. What it's not going to do is maybe provide back any kind of interaction to it. So it is, essentially sort of screenshots stitched together in a variety of ways, but it's not interactive in the sense of like, um, it's going to do any calculations in the back end or anything like that. And so you can sometimes have some pre-configured kind of flows for people to go through, for them to walk through, that you can begin to understand where there might be traps or things that are working well. But it's not going to, for instance, it's not going to find any bugs, and it's not going to do any heavy computing in the back end.
It looks like I have a couple questions in chat. I'll go ahead and read them. Kirkland asks, how do you get testers?
Yeah, that's a great question. We hire, well, my company has a division, a recruiting division, but there's, it's essentially market research. And so people sign up to be a part of panels. And then we end up, well, I should preface, that would be for sort of a general consumer audience, or maybe a business to business audience where we have, reasonable, we have a high incident rate, is what they would call it, of people out there who might fit that profile. So we develop a screener, which is a set of questions, almost like a survey, that would help us identify who the right people are. Very important that you talk to the right people. Otherwise, you get garbage data. And then we have those people, they reach out and they, do everything from advertising on Facebook to getting people to sign up for their panel. And they have some basic information that they can kind of narrow it down. And then ultimately, people fill out a survey online, or they call them on the phone and they go through those questions with them, and then we schedule them. The other important factor in that is that we pay them to participate in studies. And so that is a key part of it as well.
Thank you. Second question, how do you tell which research to spend more time on, priority-wise?
And I'm assuming that's sort of the phases of the study, those things. It typically, it sort of is determined, in my experience, based on the complexity of the product that you're developing over time. So I'm doing some work now on some new product development, and we are spending a lot of time in that middle phase of concepting, because there's a lot of different components to it that are getting built over time. And so we do small rounds of research on a bi-weekly basis, and have been doing that for probably a year and a half with this particular team, where we can do that. With that said, I think, having that foundational work is really important at the beginning, to make sure you're sort of building the right thing and adding from that at the beginning, adding on to that as you go on.
Thank you. I think we've answered Kirkland's question, because it was asking about different quality of responses versus volunteers versus people who don't know that they're being tested.
Yeah, that's a good question. We tend to, most of the work we do, people, other than if we're looking at analytics in the back end, people are informed that they're testing, that they're being part of a research. We have to inform them. We record them. We actually live stream it out as well on a secure network for stakeholders to watch and watch the different sessions and so forth. So yeah, we do have to inform them. We do get some variety in the quality of responses that we get from people. But that, sometimes that's just kind of personality based, I would say. Some people tend to sort of engage a little bit differently. Children can be a bit of a mixed bag. We do a lot of work with kids as well. And so that can be a bit of a mixed bag, where you have people who, kids can sometimes have a hard time pretending that this actually works or something along those lines, or really know what you're asking from them. But that tends to be sort of where quality can happen. There's my boss likes to say there's two really important things. One, you got to make sure you're talking to the right people, and that you have to make sure you're asking them the right questions. And if those two aren't there, then you're sort of hosed. You won't get good data.
Any other questions?
If you've used somebody as a tester for something that you're building, and then you make some changes to it, can the same testers be brought back, or does that previous knowledge negate their usability?
Yeah, that would depend a little bit on what you're testing. So from the standpoint of, if you're looking at something like discoverability, that I would recommend not bringing them back, right? Are they able to find what they want to, what they need to find on here? If you're thinking about, there are instances where you maybe have a very specialized audience of people. And in that case, and so in that sense, you have a very small number of people. In that sense, it may be okay to bring them back from the standpoint of you're building something specific for them. But generally, we don't bring people back for a second run, especially if it's something for sort of a general consumer, or there's a large number of people that we can test from. We usually sort of limit that, and in fact, we usually limit even how often we allow them to participate from. We don't want people who've been in a study in the last, say, 3 months or 6 months. We tend to sort of hold on them.
I have a quick question. Quick haha. As a developer, what can we do to make better interfaces for people who are just coming into computing? And that, I know for myself, I don't have the same beginner's mind that I used to when I was an actual beginner.
Yeah, I think the first thing to do, the first thing I would do is encourage you to sit down with people and watch them use things, and not try to solve, not try to show them, which is challenging. And really, and let them know what you're doing. You don't, I've learned in life, it's not okay to ask your family members to show you how they would do it without, when they ask you for help, without, sort of letting them know that you're trying to learn from them as well. But that, I would say, is sort of the first thing to do, is to, use an open mind to try to understand sort of how are they thinking about it, and what are they seeing that is different from what you may be seeing in the interface. And once you start to do that, it really begins to open up how things may change for you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
It looks like we have a couple here. So when people ask questions, is anybody else here?
Yeah, no, I think that was more interface related.
Yeah. Yep. I will say the other thing, I talked a little bit about data scientists, but we often also do a fair number of studies for thinking about software developers, for example, as users. So working with various companies where looking at their documentation is a good example, and trying to understand what kind of documentation do software developers need? How do they go about finding it and thinking about it? And have hopefully helped some of the companies that you may be working with, I don't know, make better documentation, for example, or better tool sets for developers, data scientists, and so forth. to work with.
One other quick question that just popped in my head. Have you found discoverability to be more challenging with recent interface developments? Stuff like voice interfaces and the modern thing of moving things into certain little areas on the screen.
Well, certainly voice interface we've found has created a lot of different challenges in the sense of people being able to troubleshoot and repair problems that I use repair in the sense of when you run into an issue and you troubleshoot and you kind of fix it on your own, people being able to sort of work through those instances, because the way that voice technologies work is not like how we talk with normal people. So you and I may have a moment where we misunderstand each other, and we can very often quickly work it out so that we can understand each other. And that is enormously difficult with all of the voice technologies. And so in that sense, it's very difficult. And then you layer on top of that there's nothing visual to tell you sort of what to do next and so forth, or at least in some of them. There are smart screens and so forth that can help with that. But that does end up creating quite a bit of issues there. There's also, interfaces now are often much more subtle in the visual treatment for a lot of good reasons. You don't often want a lot of extra visual noise in there, but that can create some discoverability issues in, is this clickable, for example, or tappable, and people sort of not realizing it. And that's a great thing that if you only need to see that a few times in a session and you say, okay, people are going to overlook that. Let's add a little visual weight here. Let's put a little, make it look more like a button or something along those lines. And then that can help solve those problems.
Guest, do you have a question? I'm seeing a hand raised on the user interface here. Now I see a hand removed. Okay.
Oh, does mine shows up as guest, doesn't it? Can you hear me? This is
Yes.
Carlos.
Yep.
Hey.
Okay. Hey, I was you mentioned like nausea with some of this virtual reality stuff. I was wondering if there's any if you get any sensory overload from people, and if it's predominantly children, or if there's adults, or even just a general basis of sensory overload with any of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. No, I would not. We haven't really studied specifically sensory overload. And, what I'm basing this off of is we've actually doing VR studies, have had hundreds of people now for a variety of things come into our labs for different purposes, and have not really had any issues with people, for example, with motion sickness or fainting. I don't want to say any, but it's not a common thing for us to see. Now, part of that may be that we do a little bit of screening where we ask people if they're going to come in, say, do you have issues with motion sickness or anything like that? And so we tend to screen those out because we're not specifically studying that issue. But it is, motion sickness. I sometimes, after being in it for a little while, might feel a little nauseous. So it is something I think for them to work out. And there's a lot that they're doing with sort of how the optics appear in there to help ameliorate some of those issues that people are having. I don't know enough about the techniques that they're using, but it takes a lot of really sort of sophisticated math behind it to try to solve some of those problems.
Any other questions? What would you say would be the most challenging user interface that you've had to work with? Just curious.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I mean, there's probably, I think from a technical standpoint, there was one we did years ago that was essentially setting up a private cloud system. And so for our researcher to really learn that, she had quite a lot of heavy lifting to sort of understand how people were going about setting up a private cloud system. There are other, we often work with interfaces that have a lot of complexity, but just intense in the sense of has a lot going on. So we did some work for a blood bank, or a company that made blood banking software for folks to use. And where it started out was, I mean, you might imagine something from the mid 90s, with a lot of different windows and so forth, and really some key components to it, like getting blood in an emergency situation, sort of buried beneath a lot of menus and so forth. And so, we did a set of research and worked with our design team to really sort of simplify that and think about how do you prioritize what's most important here in the interface, and kind of go from the beginning. So yeah, that's one that comes to mind for sure.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, it's often those, the most challenging ones are often the tools that are built for people to use in work environments. I will say that those are the ones where there maybe, it's not a consumer grade thing at the start. And so in that sense, it ends up, not maybe getting a lot of the initial attention it needs. And so there's a ton of complexity there that we need to help sort of tease out and simplify for people.
I know the ones that I've seen that have been the worst have been the ones where someone has one idea of how the thing is supposed to work, and then the people that actually use it have a completely different idea of how everything is supposed to be used. And yeah,
Yep.
That can really get interesting.
Yep.
Any other questions, comments? Speaking of voice interfaces, my Minecraft just went boop.
Yeah, I just have a comment, and my background goes back some 50 years, and what I ran into a lot is that people were afraid to even touch a keyboard.
Yep.
They're afraid of breaking something. Is that still a problem?
That's interesting. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was really thinking about that a lot, that there was a lot of fear. And it was, I think you're absolutely right. There was a lot of fear that I may do something wrong. I may damage it in some way.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. There's, I think the fear that we see often now is, I think that still exists for certainly for some people. The other fear, I think, for people who are more familiar with technology is sort of what information it's gathering on me. What is this maybe doing to me personally, and so forth. And so there's a different kind of fear that's actually started to emerge that we see often now, where people are saying, maybe I don't want so much of this, and this isn't really useful to me, and so forth. And let's think about my privacy, for example, and so forth.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yep.
Go ahead. Oh, sorry. I misinterpreted the yup. Someone say that they have a question. Talk about usability. Anyone else? Yay, no?
So
Go ahead.
this is perhaps not usability so much as mental models of how the application works.
Yep.
My background, I started up with a command line, so I was very, very aware of where my files were on my home directory. My wife was not brought up in computers and started in Windows and was usually using mostly Microsoft Word. So when she wanted me to do something with a file, she'd try to give me the name, and I'm lost because I don't know where it's stored. And I'd ask her, and she would bring up Microsoft Word to find it, not the file explorer.
Yep.
It seems that that whole mental model of how the application works would affect what kind of user interface you would get.
Yep. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one of the challenges is often designing for different sort of mental models that people may have, or even sort of, you're sort of looking at the interface and how you might find something. There's also what you might use it for can be very different for people and have different conceptions of it. and what they're doing with it. And so that's one of the reasons why it often takes multiple rounds of iteration and thinking about how do we make something that is sort of maybe maps the way that your wife was thinking about it, but also allows for the kind of complexity that you have and that you're looking for, or the sort of maybe a more detailed understanding of it. And that's a real, it takes, it's one of the reasons why sometimes you can end up with bad interfaces when you don't sort of account for those different user types. There's different ways of thinking.
Any other? Oh, Harold, go ahead.
Oh, there we go. All the unmutes. So I think I've seen a couple trends or new ideas in UE over the past 10, 20 years. Those the ones that come to mind being Microsoft, where they threw out toolbars and even menu bars in favor of the ribbon. Web browsers, mostly Chrome, where they basically threw the UE away entirely, or kind of shoved it over to the side. And then your like handheld devices, where rather than presenting UE elements on the screen, everything is gestures. Do you have any thoughts on those, or other new directions of interface that might be coming down?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about, well, one, I don't know specifically about new directions, but I would anticipate that people will continue to experiment for a while, and some of them will work well, and some of them maybe not so much. The difference is, I think, between what you see in the desktop and a mobile smartphone device. If you think back to some of the early smartphones where they were really trying to mimic the desktop, and they literally, I think the Windows mobile one had a little start menu that you had to try to hit with your little stylus to get it to come up. Those kinds of, when you start switching form factors, that's when you really begin to see different types of patterns and so forth, and how the interface is designed in different genres that emerge. And so looking at, for instance, the wearable or smartwatch, and considering how that's going to evolve is where I would look. And then any kind of there are a lot of rumors out there about augmented reality, for example, glasses and so forth, that may be coming from some of the major tech companies. And so I would begin to think about what those kinds of interfaces may look like and so forth.
Just a quick program note. Folks, if you would please fill out the comment card. That would be amazing. Harold, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm curious. Have you done much testing with VR? I mean, besides the Firefox, something that's more, because the Firefox sounds to me more like take a desktop application and put it in VR because technology or something. I mean, I'm not gonna impugn them, especially if they're paying client years. But have you done any more of just more natural VR interfaces?
Yeah, I can't get into the specifics of it because of client confidentiality, but I have active work going with a hardware maker, and we look at all aspects of it. So a VR hardware maker, and so looking at the physical devices themselves, so the controllers, and doing ergonomic research to make sure they fit well in people's hands, looking at the headset to make sure it fits on people's heads, doesn't cause neck pain, things like that, to thinking about different types of use cases. So a popular use case, obviously, is gaming in VR, right? And if you're familiar with VR, there's games like Beat Saber and so forth. So we'll have people go through that, but we'll also have people do different kinds of activities that as they think about what the system may look like in the future and so forth, going through those different sorts of things, as well as a really important one is new user experience. So having people go sort of not so much unbox it and so forth and things like that, but after they've got the headset on and they're new to VR, how do you introduce them to what they can do, to being able to, for example, move around, set up any kind of a boundary around them so that if they are able to walk around or something like that, they don't, smash their face into the wall, and sort of introduce them to different types of gestures that they may do. So that could be, throwing things, picking up things in the virtual environment, or doing different kinds of input. So using a virtual keyboard of some sort, or using any kind of a chat system, or there's a variety of different things that they might do.
I think I've noticed one thing with VR stuff. It always feels like putting things down or rotating things is always a challenge, especially with like mouse-driven stuff. It always feels like a real challenge, as opposed to like, I don't know if I've ever, I mean, for like gloves and whatnot, I don't know if they have made that a lot simpler with that.
Yeah, it can be very difficult, especially to get sort of the haptic feedback right on it, so that it feels like you're picking up a pencil or what have you, versus in getting that depth correct. It can be quite a bit of challenge and a lot of engineering in that.
I know we were playing with Mozilla Hubs, because one of our previous presenters was presenting on Mozilla Hubs, and trying to get an object sitting on top of a table felt like very difficult, and figuring out what the scale of that object was as well to put it on the table felt really challenging. So
yeah, when we test different approaches to that, we'll work with an engineering team there and have people go in and play little games. So that might be throwing darts or just picking up stuff and playing around with it, or make up little games. And really the whole point there is to just have them to try out those different kinds of interaction types. And then one of the things we often do is have them then where would you invest your money, for example, like this one or this system, and where do you think it's sort of more important to put development resources, and ask the participants that, and so forth.
Do you find that play tends to get a better response out of people than giving them a task to do?
That's a good. I think it depends on the objectives of what you're trying to do. I think one of the things that sort of play or exploration, just in general, can help you do is really to sort of understand one, use cases you may not be thinking of, but just how people sort of naturally approach something. We often do sometimes need to make sure that, for example, people are able to log in and set up an account, and that's you can only sort of have people explore for so long before you say, okay, yeah, actually, I want you to go through and do that. Or I want you to, you may have a page somewhere that you want to make sure people find. And so you need to sort of say, okay, why don't you go find this and make sure they do that. But I think, yeah, that sort of natural exploration is super important. In fact, we often think of our sessions as funnels, in the sense that we try to start out really wide and have people do sort of almost whatever they want. And then we narrow it down and we get to those very specific tasks at the end that we know we need to cover, and so forth. But we don't sort of spoil the good stuff of seeing what they do without us prompting them at the beginning before we get to those specific tasks.
Very cool. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much for this presentation. That was excellent. I really appreciate that.
It's my pleasure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a question. Do you miss Detroit?
I do. Yeah. I tried. Well, I haven't been back in. I've not been back now in well over. I haven't been back since I think the last time I was there was probably fall of 2019. And then, the COVID world hit. So all of my plans to go visit, but definitely look forward to hopefully this summer getting back there or in the fall, and going to see a football game and so forth. Definitely looking forward to visiting and getting some good food and seeing friends and family for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate this. This has been very informative.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I've heard about the mug for a long time, so it's great to see you all and talk with you about UX.
Excellent. Speaking of UX, we have a wonderful UX that we would